The South. The American South has been called the second homeland of millions of blacks who migrated to the North in the early 20th century, with Africa being the original homeland of enslaved Africans who were brought to the South as forced migrants. Just saying the South invokes more than a region. It is also a state of mind, a region in which, sang Billie Holiday, its southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in a southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Arguably, it is the region where so-called black trauma began. How has it changed since the 1960s, with blacks shedding their caste status and becoming fuller participants in the American scheme of things? Adolph, the author of The South, Jim Crow and His Afterlives, offers his views on this land. This is From Black Power to Black Trauma. I'm Norman Kelly. Adolph Reed is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in U.S. politics with special focus on the intersection of race and class in American politics. His most recent book, The South, Jim Crow and His Afterlives, examines how the region has and hasn't changed since the 1960s. A son of the South, he was born in the Bronx but raised in New Orleans. Since he's from the land of gumbo, I had to ask a specific question. Was his family considered Creole due to the fact that he is of Cuban heritage?
I'll put it to you like this. My family, by and large, does not consider themselves Creole.
Okay.
The world that we moved in, since before my time and since, is basically that Catholic Creole middle-class social world.
Mm-hmm.
So I've sometimes joked that among the many ways that there is to be a Creole, one of them is to be the I'm not a Creole.
After clearing that up, my next question was the Jim Crow South a totalitarian system as opposed to merely being segregated?
Yeah, but Jim Crow wasn't administered as tightly as you would tend to think of with a totalitarian system. I mean, I might have mentioned this in the book, but unlike the apartheid regime in South Africa, or at least unlike my understanding of the apartheid regime in South Africa, the rules varied on a quotidian level from place to place. So even the way, for instance, that segregation in public transit was enforced differed greatly from city to city. I mean, more to the level of adequate than the law. And that just seemed to me to increase the terroristic element of the system because, of course, black people were always assumed to know what the rules were. And if you broke a rule, it couldn't be because of an accident because you didn't know, right? It could only be because you were uppity and needed to be put in place. So I don't think I'd characterize it as totalitarian. I wouldn't argue against somebody who wanted to characterize it as that either.
Reed wrote, quote, "Unquestioned power and deference persist in the region, but their connection to race is no longer straightforward or easily predictable. The tendency to mistake superficially familiar imagery for actual continuity threatens to obscure how the present differs most meaningfully from the past," unquote. Could you give one or two examples of that?
Oh, sure. Let me think. One thing that I mentioned is that, like, when I'm someplace now in all white upscale neighborhoods, right? I can feel eyes on me. You know what I mean? In fact, when I moved to the Chicago suburbs in '91 and I was looking at houses, I realized that one of my criteria was I didn't want to live someplace where the neighbors would call the police on me to protect my property values. Right. So, and this is especially meaningful when I'm in New Orleans because a lot of those areas are areas that were historically segregated, and I never learned my way around them. I still have that same feeling, and concern that I need to get the hell out of there before somebody calls the police on me. But at this point, there are as likely as not to be some Black people living in those areas, and that race, it's a little clearer that race does the shorthand work for identifying class difference now that it actually did then too. So what you see is, and then there are a lot of other instances. I mean, just what seem like little rituals of deference and subordination that strike me as being like they were 60 years ago aren't quite the same now, right, Robert? There's a difference. They're not quite racial, and they don't even necessarily mean deference, right? They can, but you're just as likely, a middle-class Black person is just as likely to get the deference that an upper-status white person would get today and it would have gotten 60 years ago.
So has race shifted into the background as a metaphor?
Well, see, that's an interesting question, because race appears to be just as central in the South now as it was 60 years ago, right? Right, like in a lot of ways. I mean, think about politics, for instance. Race is just as much the central fault line in politics in places like South Carolina and Louisiana and elsewhere now as it was then, with some important differences. For instance, Black people can vote. So when David Duke ran for governor and for U.S. Senate in Louisiana in 1991 and 1990, in the Senate race, I think he got a majority of the white vote, right? But the good news was that after 1965, a majority of the white vote wasn't enough to win with, right? But race was always, right, a shorthand, right? And it functions as a shorthand now, but in different ways, like crime stuff, other stuff, stuff like that. And it strikes me that that a lot of people prefer to talk about race than to talk about economic injustice, right? And even will strain the use of race as a metaphor to keep from talking about economic injustice on its own terms.
Although it's counterintuitive, Americans are much more comfortable talking about race than class, because when you talk about race, it seems to be apparent. He's Black, she's Asian, blah, blah, blah. But class, you really have to think about.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point too. And I mean, it's kind of funny, right along that line. I mean, the reaction that you get from people, I find kind of interesting because it makes me think right away of, going back to Bill Clinton and now, through Joyanne Reed and that whole crew, when people are always talking about we need to have a conversation about race, and I keep thinking, well, that's all you people want to talk about, right? So, what's there to say? You can't talk about any damn thing else, right? And it's kind of like how you get a bunch of Spike Lee fan Black people around. It's only a matter of time before you hear somebody saying, well, we need to talk about the thing that nobody wants to talk about, which is what's now called colorism among Black people. And I thought, well, why did we not talk about that, right? And how is that not the only thing you want to talk about? And especially because there's no real policy warrant, right, for either one of them, frankly, right? I mean, for race, you can say, okay, firm anti-discrimination, and then maybe affirmative action or maybe something else on top of that, some set-asides or whatever. But the conversation about racism just is something that can go on endlessly. and never produces anything because it's not in the nature of the topic to produce anything. And I think the colorism thing is like another version of the same thing. I mean, we can talk about it, but where does it get you?
Reed himself has experienced how the preferred discourse about race over class or other categories can be sandbagged by others, preventing good faith discussions.
I wasn't exactly disinvited, but I was substantively disinvited. And the people who've objected to that characterization, I think, are disingenuous. See, here's what happened. A friend of mine from Philly who had moved to New York and had gotten active with the New York DSA chapter. And in fact, in both 2016, I think, and 2020, she was the person who did all the coordinating for DSA buses that sent people out to primary states to canvass for Sanders. Right? And after I had published a piece in Common Dreams fairly early in the pandemic, sounding the alarm about the easy way that people are sliding into a racial disparity narrative about it and all the potential for mischief that was there, Carissa came up with the idea of having a DSA Zoom meeting, right? Panel, well, meeting. This co-sponsored by the Philly DSA and the New York DSA, with me and my colleague Merlin Chalkwani, with whom I co-authored a similar piece in the New England Journal of Medicine. And the point was that we were going to talk about racial medicine and the pandemic and the mischief that can be associated with racial medicine, basically. So things were going along, and about a week before the event, some guy took down the announcements of the event from the New York DSA chapter's message board. Fine, whatever. Like more than a couple hundred people had signed up for it. But then it was a Sunday afternoon it was scheduled for. And Sunday, like late morning, Merlin and I found out that the self-constituted group calling itself BIPOC and Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus demanded that the event be, now I can't recall whether they ever said canceled, but they demanded definitely that it be reformulated as a debate between and this is how they characterize it, my class reductionist views and their Afro-Socialist views. So like this was about 2 hours before the thing was supposed to happen. And it was early enough in the universe of Zoom that it wasn't clear whether effective precautions could be taken to keep them from blowing the thing up somehow. So Merlin and I talked to the sponsors who were prepared to go along with it, but we determined, well, fuck it, right? There's no point in our doing this, right? I mean, it's not worth it. So technically, it wasn't canceled, but we canceled it. But we canceled it because they wanted to change the nature of the event at the last minute. And I noticed I don't spend a lot of time in the left warrens on the internet, but I noticed that one of the lines coming from that element was, well, so why would he want to have an open debate with these people? And that's what happened.
That episode is a good encapsulation of the state of the American left.
And look, it's only gotten worse since then. I mean, just think of how they all line up on the war in Ukraine at this point, right? I mean, this just blows me away, and a lot of my friends. So where'd this come from?
Returning to the subject of the book, Reed relates how a middle-class contemporary of his wound up going to jail for doing a joyride while he himself got a good talking to for stealing, escaping the worst that could happen to a Negro child back then. The capricious nature of the South underscore how almost any white person had power over any black person.
Well, yeah, well, so one difference was that his encounter was with the police. right? Because what happened was, like, he was with some friends, and they stole a car and the joyride, and that's how he wound up in Angola. Now, I could have wound up in Angola if well, actually, as young as I was too young to go to Angola. I would have wound up in Baker. If the people who own this little bodega were a different sort of people, right? So I mean, so that's one way that you can, well, that's one instance where the capriciousness and the arbitrariness made for a happy ending, right? I mean, it could have gone the other way around. So, and I mean, that's part of it too, right? Like any white person potentially had the power to ruin your life or to take it even, right? I mean, a friend of mine who's working on a gold case project in Orleans Parish now was just telling me about a woman, I think it was a woman, who, well, yeah, I'm conflating stories, but about somebody who was getting on a bus across the river and who either jostled a white person or had an altercation with a white person, and it was even worse than that. There's a guy who was getting on a bus across the river in Algiers. A white woman got on ahead of him, didn't have the money, and like this was in the early 40s. So the black guy offered to give her the nickel, and the bus driver took umbrage at this black man offering to pay the white woman's bus fare. Jacked him up, called the cop. Cop winds up killing him. So I mean, stuff like that happened. I mean, another incident. I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but there was a case when I was in high school of a young white woman who was supposedly attacked by a light-skinned black man in City Park and raped, right? And the cops did what the cops do, right? I mean, just think of Boston and Charles Stewart, right? I mean, they were running through black neighborhoods and housing projects and jacking people up like crazy. And to her credit, right? And I know a lot of people think it's weird for me to credit her with this, but I mean, to her credit, like, she let it go on, and she was young, like 18 or something. She let it go on for 2 or 3 days, and then her conscience just got the better of her, and she acknowledged that she had a boyfriend who was a sailor who stood her up. She was supposed to meet him in City Park, and he stood her up, and she concocted this story to get back at him, right? But there's no telling how many people got jacked up and beat down or whatever, right?
Right.
And in that context, and I mean, people want purity in the world, but like in that context, especially as a young black man, I was happy to see that she had enough decency that she just couldn't stand it anymore, because it's not like, I don't imagine that it was like she set out to frame a black man, right? Just like Susan Smith, the white woman in South Carolina who drowned her kids, right? And see, this is something else that people don't understand about what it means to say race functions as a shorthand, right? I mean, if you've done something that you can get in really serious trouble about, and want to try to save yourself, then one way to do it is to cast the culpability onto a generally recognized scapegoat, right? And yeah, I mean, it doesn't work out well for us,
Right.
but it's also but I think it's important for us to understand that's part of what's going on there, which means, among other things, and like, I know this would give the trauma people like suddenly, well, the trauma people will hear me saying this like an epileptic will see a strobe light. But race is not the only issue in the world, right? And it's possible for people to be a racist today and not a racist tomorrow, to say what racist stuff today and mean it and not mean it the next day. And right. I think about that a lot, like in the open housing fights. Right. I'm sure people said a lot of stuff, thought a lot of stuff that they, not everybody, right? But obviously, some people thought and said a lot of stuff that they never would have prior to feeling themselves cornered in that way. And that's not a defense either, right?
Given the ebb and flow of racial relationships, I wonder if things were a bit more relaxed for African Americans than back in the day.
Without question, man. Like, it doesn't. The only people who feel, something at all like that old tension are old people like me, right? I mean, there's other tensions, right? But they have less, and people may express them sometimes through a racial metaphor, like with the police and stuff. But it's different, right? In that, look, say I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, like the neighborhoods I was afraid to go in when I was a youngster. Well, if I walk in one of those neighborhoods now, and somebody calls the police to protect their property values, it's at least as likely as not that the cop who shows up is going to be black. Right, so that's a difference.
Even though racist acts still occur against blacks in the South, there is a difference in the endpoint.
Right. And you remember, this was probably 10, 15 years ago, maybe. The years all run together now. But when these idiot white boys shot and killed his brother who was staying in a motel in Jackson, Mississippi. When you're gone outside to smoke a cigarette, he drove by and shot him and killed him. What comes from the anti-racist mouthpieces, right, is it's as if nothing has changed, except for the fact that the cop who came and arrested him was black and the DA was black. So except for that, right, which is a pretty big deal, right? Right, so all that stuff means something, right? And I mean, the difference is, like, no, I mean, we literally had no recourse, man. I mean, and that's a hell of a feeling, right? But that was the point, or on one layer, that was the point of the regime.
The idea of black leadership began with the rise of Booker T. Washington in the South in 1895. But is there such a thing as black leadership in the post-civil rights era?
So Mac Bai, in the summer of 2008, wrote a generally really insipid article in the New York Times Magazine called something like, "Is Obama the End of Black Politics?" Right? And I figured you'd recall it, but like, he got almost everything wrong, basically, or shallow, right? Like including his claim that the generation of black political leaders before Obama had come out of the church, which is not true. But they're much more likely to come out of Model Cities program and Warren Bobby than by church. But the one kernel that makes that article worth reading, and for me made it worth assigning for many years, is that he said that where earlier generations of black political leadership saw themselves as envoys from the black, and he doesn't say to whom, but presumably it's from the black community to the political system. Obama's cohort see themselves as envoys to the black community, which is like saying like they're coming from the bourgeois or from the democratic elites and from the ruling class in Wall Street to tell you what your limits are, basically. But now, he doesn't follow up on that. So, but it's interesting that even he could see it.
Or put another way, today's black leadership is more integrated into the political system than black voters themselves, particularly those living at the bottom of the social well.
Cory Booker, right? When a Booker ran against Sharp James the first time, right? I mean, James is the black candidate, and Booker was the charter school candidate. And it's not just a generational shift, right? But keep in mind, though, or I'd say what I want to say for listeners, that the older figures in the black political class have accommodated completely, right? Go back to 2016, and icon of the civil rights movement, John Lewis, and Jim Clyburn, who keeps trying to present himself as an icon of the civil rights movement, both went on a vicious attack on Bernie Sanders for having advocated free public higher education and single-payer health care. And one of them, I think it was John, said, that's irresponsible for him to tell people that stuff should be free. So, I don't know how you square that. Well,
Given this dismal state of affairs in regard to black leadership, one wonders why today's critical or oppositional black intellectuals have not created more think tanks to address such issues.
Oh, that's an interesting question, too. Well, the Congressional Black Caucus has something, right?
I think there's something called the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies, but it's almost a non-entity.
Right. Yeah, well, it's been around for a long time, and it's interesting because they used to do more stuff than they've done in the last 20 years. The first thing, I guess, is that to have a think tank, you'd have to have a policy agenda that you're concerned with. And I don't think they have one, right? Just more and more appointments. But that's an interesting question.
If the black working class can't depend on black leadership or black intellectuals, why can't they organize themselves?
Mainly because they don't have the capacity.
Okay.
And if people are stretched to the limit, right? Mm-hmm. See, this is where, among the many ways that the new left, mea culpa, maxima culpa, went astray was, letting liberals convince them that Lenin was a dirty word, right? Because you need organization and you need cadre level kind of organizers whose primary focus in the life is to make this stuff congeal, rather than make it work. Best place to do it is in trade unions, right? And that's one of the things that we were always about, just trying to connect, especially with the intermediate level of trade union leadership. And in fact, that's part of the audience that we're really trying to cultivate with this podcast too, right? People who.
In case you missed it, Reed is affiliated with Class Matters, a podcast that's delivering the word about how class and how people in the working class can come together and move forward. I want to thank my guest, Adolph Reed. This has been From Black Power to Black Trauma. I'm Norman Kelly. Thank you for listening.